If you only know how to rub her clit and pump away mindlessly, you're leaving 90% of her pleasure potential untapped. Her pleasure isn't random. Her body is a goldmine of orgasmic hotspots that is written into her nervous system. And today, I'm handing you the treasure map. When you learn how to navigate it, you can unlock orgasms that make her addicted to you. Inside this video, you'll learn the 9 powerful erogenous zones that drive women absolutely wild, including some hidden spots deep inside her you didn't even know existed. I'll explain how her body's nerves connect to her brain, why the right rhythm is the secret to making her orgasm harder, and how you can combine different types of stimulation to give her the most intense orgasms of her life. And later in this video, I'm going to reveal one weird fetish that accidentally stimulates one of her most powerful erogenous zones. So let's start with the obvious one, the clitoris. Clitoral stimulation has been described by women as producing a localized, external kind of orgasm. They describe it as eliciting an orgasm from clitoral stimulation. So it's incorrect to think of it as a clitoral orgasm exactly. Rather, it's a clitorally elicited orgasm. If you look at this diagram here, the pudendal nerve is the nerve that carries the sensation from the clitoris up to the brain. And you'll notice that it's an external nerve. It's running along the outside of the body, not along the internal organs so much. While we have this diagram up, let's move on to the second erogenous zone. Notice how in this diagram, the pudendal nerve actually runs both along the anal canal and it sits on the outside of the anal sphincter. That's right, the anus, the anal region, is actually an erogenous zone for women. This is why rimming is actually very pleasurable to women and in some cases can cause an orgasm for some women. And it's also why anal sex can also cause really intense orgasm for some women as well. Now, this all depends on the way that any particular woman's nerves line up in these regions of her body. Now, every woman is different in this regard, in the way that her nervous system is intimately spread through different regions of her body. So that's why some women can come easier from certain types of stimulation than others. The next type of orgasm we're going to talk about is the vaginally stimulated orgasm. Now, this has been described by women as feeling more internal and deep, which makes sense because the nerves that carry sensation from the internal areas of the vagina are visceral nerves like the pelvic nerve. The next type of orgasm that women can experience is a cervical orgasm. Now, they tend to be experienced more like a full body orgasm with these waves of pleasure instead of a quicker peak of pleasure that often comes from an external clitoral stimulated orgasm, for example. Clitoral orgasm can also come with very big emotional releases like crying or laughing. So the nerves that carry the sensation from the cervical area to the brain are the hypogastric nerve, the pelvic nerve, and the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is the most important nerve of our parasympathetic nervous system, often known as our rest and digest nervous system, which brings us a sense of calmness and relaxation. This could explain why these kinds of orgasms are often associated, like I said before, with things like crying and laughing and these very emotional displays. And here's a fun fact. The vagus nerve actually bypasses the spinal cord, and because of that, cervical orgasms have been demonstrated in studies using MRI in women with complete spinal cord injuries. If you like this video so far, guys, give us a like and give us a subscribe. We have tons of videos on this channel dissecting all kinds of advice in regards to sex. Now, when we talk about cervical orgasm, there's a couple that we really need to focus on. The first one is known as the A-spot orgasm. 2 ways to trigger these really intense cervical orgasms are by stimulating 2 regions around the cervix. One of those regions is known as the A-spot, and it sits right where the bladder and the cervix kind of almost touch each other. Now, the other spot, which lies on the opposite side of the cervix, resting underneath on the bottom of the cervix. This is sometimes called the C spot and other people call it the O spot. Whatever you want to label it, that's where it sits basically. But you've got these 2 spots on either side of the cervix. Now, these spots can be kind of tricky to reach. If you have giant hands, it can actually be kind of tricky to get back there. But if you have slightly smaller hands, like more deck-style hands, you can actually get into the back of this area of the vagina and directly stimulate these 2 spots, this A spot and this O spot that we talked about. And if you can pull this off, you will give a woman a absolutely life-changing experience. The reason why these 2 spots in particular are so powerful is because you're literally directly stimulating these parts of the body where these nerve bundles sort of sit and directly communicate with the brain. So you're directly like pushing on her brain, which lights up during orgasm. All these different orgasms, clitoral orgasm, vaginal orgasm, cervical orgasm, they stimulate slightly different places in her brain. But the interesting thing is that you can stack these orgasms on top of one another or combine them all together at the same time to trigger a more intense, complex, and pleasurable mega orgasm that lights up all these regions of her brain simultaneously. And while we're talking about the brain, let's talk about another type of orgasm, the nipple orgasm. You see, stimulation of the nipples activates the same cluster of cells in the brain, the sensory cortex, as the clitoral, vaginal, and cervical orgasm. It activates the same cluster of neurons as the genitals in the brain. That's why nipple stimulation will add to her genital stimulation like a booster effect. So you can layer the nipple stimulation on top of clitoral stimulation or on top of vaginal stimulation or on top of cervical stimulation to give a kind of two-pronged effect. Let's briefly talk about the Penfield homunculus map. This doctor, he took people's scalps off and exposed their brain while they were under like local anesthetic. And then he took an electrode and stimulated different parts of the sensory cortex. The sensory cortex, by the way, is basically like a band that kind of runs across the brain from ear to ear. When he was stimulating these parts of the sensory cortex, the patients would reply back to him and say, oh, it feels like you're touching me on the toe. It feels like you touched me on the elbow. It feels like you touched me on the wrist, or something like that, like whatever part he was touching, right? And so he created this homunculus map of mapping the different regions of the sensory cortex and where they corresponded to on the body. And the interesting thing is this midline ridge right in the center between the two hemispheres of the brain, that is where the genital sensations are felt. But very interestingly, this is also where the feet are on the sensory cortex. The feet and the genitals are right next to one another on the sensory cortex. And that's why feet and toes are actually a really powerful erogenous zone on women. That's right, stimulating the feet and the toes sends signals to the same region of the brain as stimulating her genitals. Some studies even show that licking the toes in the right way can be just as stimulating to a woman as oral sex can. This explains why feet massages are often considered a form of erotic foreplay. And maybe the foot fetish guys actually had something with this all along. The next interesting erogenous zone is just above the ear canal. There's a branch of the vagus nerve that carries sensations from this part of the ear, and it goes right to the genital region of the sensory cortex. This could explain why a tongue in the ear can be highly arousing to a lot of people. And our next erogenous zone, while this won't trigger an orgasm directly, is a very highly erogenous zone, and that is the neck, which can be played with in a few different ways, from gently or passionately kissing along the neck to lightly erotically nibbling on the nape or the trap area, which a lot of women absolutely love and can leave them with somewhat of a shivering ecstasy sensation, to erotically choking a woman, which involves not restricting airflow, but restricting blood flow. Being very careful when you do this. Make sure you always do this with the correct technique. You're not trying to cause any damage or cause any restrictions to the actual airflow of it. And in fact, you can learn how to do that correctly right here on this very channel. Now, an interesting observation when it comes to studying female orgasm, or orgasms in general, is that you can think of an orgasm as a wave or a wave function if you're a physicist. Each particular type of orgasm has a certain resonant frequency. During sex, you might describe this as a rhythm or a pace of stimulation. You have to stimulate the area with the right resonant frequency in order to achieve an orgasm. If you hit the wrong resonant frequency, you can interrupt the orgasm and kind of cancel out that wave function. A good analogy is to think of it like bouncing someone on a trampoline. If you have two people jumping together at the same frequency, you can then double jump someone and make them jump even higher if you hit with the right resonant frequency. But if one person jumps out of sequence with the other, you can kind of cancel those two waves out and stop each other from jumping higher. The same thing goes for pushing someone on a swing. If you push them at the wrong point in their arc, you're going to cancel out their momentum and they'll come to a stop. If you time it correctly, then you can make them go much, much higher. So if you're unable to make your partner orgasm, or a particular woman you're with struggles to orgasm with you probably need to just adjust your rhythm, and then you'll hit her particular resonant frequency. If you'd like to learn a few techniques on how to hit that resonant frequency, then check out this video right over here.